702.
The Naked Scientist.
Dr. Smith, it's so good to chat to you, and thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon.
Jonathan, it's a pleasure. Really nice to chat. How are you?
I'm spectacular, thank you, and it's lovely to be with you and our listeners this afternoon. So, we got some questions for you, and I love hearing all the answers that you give us on a weekly basis. So, we've got somebody here that says, it's Mr. Chen. He says, "Hi there, Dr. Chris. Please, can you tell us why a dog's nose is constantly wet?" That's from Mr. Chen in Pomona.
He's presumably got a runny
It's
nose
always-
for the
it's
same
always
reason
wet.
we have a wet nose. There's a number of reasons. One is that dogs do lick their noses. Two, they may have a cold. Dogs get colds just like we do, and that gives them a runny nose, and that can make things damper. But mostly it's because, just as our own noses do, dogs' noses have special erectile tissue in them that has the job of warming and moistening the air that it breathes in. Your nose is exactly the same. And we do this for a number of reasons. But one of them, probably the most important one, is that if you do breathe in very cold, dry air, A, that would not go down well when it got to your lungs. But B, it's much better if you moisten it and warm it up before it gets into you. So as the air goes over the nasal tissue, it gets made warmer. It also gets made damper. And this is much better for the tissue because if it is wetter, it won't dry out the tissue as it goes further inside your airways, which would have the effect of potentially injuring that tissue and stopping it doing what it does well, which is to mop up any dust and dirt and other nasties that are in there by making the air swirl and slam into a sticky layer of mucus. If the mucus got dried out, it wouldn't be able to act like a filter and extract all the nasties that are being breathed in. So that is the reason, and some of that moisture will run down towards the outside world with exhaled breath, and very warm, moist air from inside, as you breathe it out, will hit colder tissue on the outside, and some of it will condense. So you get some dampness left behind on the way out as well. So I think it's a combination of all those factors.
Okay, lovely. Now we got a question from Mpo. Says, "Good afternoon, Dr. Chris. How does one improve short-term memory after a brain injury, especially if you want to study, but you can't remember what you just studied? Also, why does the brain work like this as the long-term memory is great?" So her long-term memory is great, but when it comes to studying and her short-term memory and recalling things, she just is struggling there. So how can we help Mpo?
Sorry to hear you've got that problem, Paul. I think really the way to think about this is memory is not just one thing. We remember different things in different ways. Some memories are memories we've had for your entire lifetime. Those are long-term memories. Some memories are new ones you made just now, and that's what I think you're referring to. And they're actually in different places in the brain. When we make a new memory, it's centered on a structure called the hippocampus. You've got one of those on each side of the brain. And this forms some kind of special electrical and neurochemical imprint of the information, which it holds for a short period of time before that information is translated to long-term store in other regions of the brain. And the hippocampus appears to be crucial in enabling you to form that short-term memory and then imprint it in a pattern of connections elsewhere in the brain. And if you damage the hippocampus or the circuitry that's involved in that process, it can impair that from happening. And it gives you what is called an anterograde, in other words, going forward, amnesia. The most famous case of this was somebody who had really bad epilepsy, and it was arising from a region in the temporal lobe on the hippocampus. And so doctors, in order to treat the epilepsy, because it was life-threatening, had to remove this part of the brain. This person, who's famously known as HM and has passed away now, went through the rest of his life being able to recall past memories very well, but couldn't make any new ones. And keeping a diary of his experiences, his diary would say, I've just woken up, because he assumed, because he had no memory of what had gone just a few moments before, he must have been asleep. But there were some things he did nonetheless manage to remember. Muscle memory that's a bit of a misnomer, but actually we remember movements very, very well because they're laid down in a different part of the brain. So although you might struggle to remember what you were just thinking about, you might very well be able to type extremely well on a computer keyboard because your brain knows where the fingers have to go to type all the letters, for example. And so some ways to improve memories can be, or to facilitate if you have got a problem storing new memories, is to find other ways to use your other ways of forming memories to help reinforce your short-term memory. It might be that by writing things down, not only does that help you to form a stronger impression in your brain of what you're trying to remember, but it also helps to convert some of that memory into a motor program, a muscle memory as it were, which can help with recall later. And I always advise people, no matter how good your memory is, make notes when you're in the classroom or in a lecture or trying to remember something, and then write them out later. And by doing that, you actually put the information through your brain multiple times. You also put it into a pattern your brain can remember and recognize most optimally. And then you've also got a motor way of recalling it as well. So really, practice makes perfect, but also look at these other things. If you've got things that you know you can remember well, ask yourself, why do I remember these well? Why do I find this sort of thing easier to do? And then see if you can use that mechanism to help you to learn the things that you find harder to recall. It won't be perfect, but usually with rehearsal and patience, you can improve things.
Yeah, I mean, my missus says my short-term memory is terrible, especially when she says, why didn't you wash the dishes?
Put the bins
I
out.
just,
Yeah, that's right.
Just
Empty
forgot,
the dishwasher.
Just forgot, yeah. Let's go to Temba from Pretoria. Temba, you got a question on microchips and plans for microchips.
Yes, I do, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, I'd like to ask Dr. Smith, is the retinal microchip implant that was piloted in Britain in 2012, is it still relevant for people who are blind for possible microchip implant? If it's still relevant or not?
Hi, Temba. The answer is yes. This is being worked on, and they are getting some reasonably good results with this now, to the point where people who couldn't see before can actually recognise things like letters. I don't mean as in the thing that comes through your mailbox, I mean as in written letters. So you can read text. Now, it's not brilliant, and in many cases it's just black and white. It doesn't produce the full repertoire of the visual experience yet, but it's a dramatic step forward. And the way in which this works is that at the back of your eye is the retina. The retina is a light-sensitive sheet that converts light waves into brain waves, putting it bluntly. Basically, it is a coding system that responds to the energy in spots of light and turns them into nerve pulses. And those nerve pulses are then transmitted to the brain from the back of the retina through a series of cells called retinal ganglion cells that make your optic nerve. And they then relay the information on to the brain, and it builds a picture of the world. So if you've lost the ability to convert the light into neurochemical information because the rods and cones don't work, which many common forms of blindness, this happens, but the optic nerve is intact, you can recruit the optic nerve cells directly and still build a picture of the world with these sorts of implants. And the way it works is that they sit against these cells that make the optic nerve, and they fire off activity, which are then picked up by the cells that make the optic nerve, and they fire a discharge into the brain. And you can tune the system so that you can show people an image. The system then works out what pattern of electrical activity to inject into the retina so that the person sees, in inverted commas, the right thing. And the idea is that you would ultimately come up with a prosthesis that was good enough that it would produce function that would enable a person to get around and navigate their way around the world and be able to see, in inverted commas, well enough to have a good quality of life. It's not there quite yet, but it's coming on leaps and bounds. So watch this space.
Thanks, Dr. Chris. Tim, I hope that one gave you all the information you need. You're listening to Kabazela and Dr. Chris Smith. Lots and lots of questions are coming through. We're going to try and get it through to as many as we can. Dr. Chris Smith, let's take a listen to one or two voice notes and get your thoughts.
Good afternoon, Kabazela. I have a question for Dr. Chris. I saw on his website he published an article speaking about the research of artificial sugar sweeteners and the effect it has on cardiovascular diseases with the research done by this other professor. Can he please summarize what was the finding and the causes?
Interesting one there, Dr. Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
Artificial
Really
sweeteners.
important, this one. And I'm surprised it didn't get more pickup around the world, actually. There was a paper out a week ago or so from Sweden. A team there actually got the idea to study this because one of their laboratory used to sit in lab meetings drinking large amounts of diet fizzy drinks. And so the guy running the lab group, Yihai Chao, said, well, why don't we work on that? And the students thought it was a joke. And they said, no, we've got mice that we are able to study in our laboratory that get the mouse equivalent of arterial disease like a human. So why don't we feed them some of the artificial sweeteners that are used to make diet drinks at the same sorts of doses that a person would ingest on a day-to-day basis for a period of time and see if it makes any difference? And what they found is that the arterial disease, the damage furring up the blood vessels in these mice, got dramatically worse when they were on aspartame, one form of artificial sweetener, compared to mice that were fed normal food. Now, when they made some further measurements, they think the reason this happens is that when you eat these sweeteners, even though there are no calories in them, they fool the body into thinking you've just eaten a load of sugar. The body responds to a load of sugar by increasing the production of insulin, the hormone from the pancreas that reins in blood glucose and tells cells to take it up and convert it into other forms of energy storage. And when this happens, blood vessels see this insulin signal and it turns on genes that also cause inflammation. So their hypothesis is that you have high levels of sweetener intake. This provokes an inappropriate high level of insulin secretion. This causes cells all over the body, but especially in the linings of blood vessels, to also turn on genes linked to inflammation. Inflammation is at the root of damage to arterial or blood vessel walls, and that increases the likelihood that you will build up fatty deposits called atherosclerosis in the walls of the blood vessels, therefore potentially increasing the risk of heart disease. Now, this is in animals. It's a single study at this stage. It's early stage, but the same mechanism applies in these animals as applies in humans. And so their next step now is to begin to explore whether the same is true in us. And if it is, I mean, that's big business and potentially a big risk. So they told me, we don't eat these things anymore. We steer clear of this stuff. All the people in the lab group have stopped drinking diet drinks. They don't go near them. And
what about you, Doc? Do you
I try and
do you
eschew
drink
them
any of the
myself.
diet?
I don't really like fizzy drinks that much, and the odd one. Look, this is all about dose dependency. If you have a huge amount of something, you're going to have a much greater effect than if you have the odd encounter with these things. So the odd brush with something because you like the odd fizzy drink that's diet, that's fine. But if you do this day in, day out to a great extent, you could well be doing more harm. And it's one of those things. It's early stages, but it's worth keeping an eye on.
Wow, okay. Fascinating study, that one. Let's go back to Victor from Joburg. He wanted to ask a question about atoms and do they have a memory? Vic, go ahead. You're with Dr. Chris.
Thank you. How are you, Dr. Chris?
I'm very well, thanks, Vic. You know,
Hello?
you should don't pay any attention to anything atoms say
Very well,
because they
thank you
make
very
up
much.
everything.
No, yes, I just want to ask if atoms do have memory.
No,
Individual.
not
That
really.
is, if an atom could have an... Yes.
No, I mean, the thing is, an atom doesn't know, in inverted commas, what it is or what it's doing. An atom is an entity which forms together with many other atoms. Everything you can see, touch, feel, interact with, the world around us is made of atoms. That's why I joked and said they make up everything. But the thing about atoms is that they do have one sort of memory in some respects, which is that if they're radioactive, it's because their nucleus is unstable. And so they have a chance that they will radioactively decay. Now, they sort of know they're radioactive, so they'll fall apart. Is that a kind of memory? Well, it means they have information locked into them, so they have the memory. There are other ways of putting information into atoms with entangling them to other atoms and putting them into certain states. So in some respects, they can have memory. Magnetism, you could argue, is a piece of metal with lots of atoms in it that has a memory. It's magnetic, but it's not memory in the sense that if I take an atom out, now there's an atom-sized hole that has a memory missing of what should be there. That's not the case. So we tend to think of the world through sort of our human experiences and then inflict that on the world around us. No, strictly speaking, atoms don't have memory, but they do have some characteristics that mean they can store information, quantum information and so on, which means that they do effectively have a memory in some respects, but it's not like human memory.
Wow, Dr. Chris, impressive as always. I mean, I always sit here with my mouth wide open listening to you answer all these random questions that you've just not had sight of before. So brilliant as always, and thank you very much for your time. Apologies to all the of you who we asked questions and we didn't get to put those through to Dr. Chris Smith, but same time, same place next week, and do get those questions in, and hopefully Rile Bogile will get them to Dr. Chris Smith, and he'll give you an answer.
702. The Naked Scientist.